In this presentation that I'll introduce, it comes in two parts. The first half, I will introduce to you some of the facts and figures about the UK higher education system, so you can get more of an idea about the sorts of universities, the types of students, and how it works. The second half, I'll talk in more detail about some of the changes that are happening in the United Kingdom, and hopefully we can, learn a little bit more about the experiences you're having here in Chile, the experiences that we're having in the UK, and what it is that we can learn from each other to try and achieve the sort of the positive social and public outcomes that I think we're all looking for. Okay, so a bit about me. As mentioned, I work for an organisation called Universities UK. We are the equivalent of the Rectors' Conference here in Chile. Our members are the executive heads of UK universities. We have 133 members at this stage. We were formed in 1919 by what was then a much smaller number of university heads in order to try and represent the interests of universities with government. They realized that their universities were increasingly in a close relationship with government, in particular receiving money from them, and they had to have a coherent and effective voice to try and influence what government would want to do in relation to higher education. So, nearly 100 years on, we've continued to develop. If you're a student of public policy and politics, we are an archetypal insider lobby group. We spend a lot of our time speaking with politicians, civil servants, and we also play quite an important role in the actual sector-owned administration of things like quality standards and public accountability. But these are all things I'll talk about in a little bit more detail as we go along. But there are a few things that it is important to think about when looking at UK higher education, and these are some of the important features here. Our members and the other institutions as well who award degrees, it's a very diverse range of institutions. Some are very large. You'll see that some have over 200,000 students enrolled. Well, one does. And also institutions have a wide range of missions as well. Of course, all institutions, they educate students. Not all institutions do research. And also some institutions have a very different view about what their social objectives are and the type of education they deliver. But what's also very important, what brings them all together, is that certainly for our members, well, in fact for all institutions, is that they're legally autonomous. Now this means that they have total control over their own financial management, they have total control over who they decide to admit, and they also have total control over what they actually teach within their institutions. And this autonomy is something that we pride and value very, very highly in our conversations with government, and we see it as an important element to the success of the system. However, whilst we may be legally autonomous, we receive large amounts of public research funding. This is allocated on a competitive basis, and it's also quite highly concentrated as well, particularly amongst universities such as Oxford and Cambridge, Imperial and UCL. But you'll find that this public money is spread across the system. Likewise, we now have a system whereby undergraduate, well, and also postgraduate, of course, education is funded by fees. But a very important element of this is a government-backed loan system, and I'll talk about this in a little bit more detail because it's both controversial and interesting within the United Kingdom. And what I think what this then points to is the original motivation for why my organisation was set up. Our organisations may be legally autonomous, but they're civic institutions with public education missions, and also they receive public money, so therefore they have to respond to the public interests of the day. And so therefore we have what we call a collaborative approach to the development of public policy and regulation within the UK system. We play an important role in that. It's usually collaborative. Sometimes it's a little bit more tense, but at the minute but usually it works fairly well, and I'll explain a little bit more about how that system is changing. So, in terms of a little bit of history about the sector, because often history is a good place to start, what's happened in the past. Obviously, a number of our institutions are very old. Oxford and Cambridge have, well, they received their royal charters in about 1200 AD, but they existed as educational institutions prior to that. Also, in around the 1500s, Scottish institutions. In Scotland, there was the Scottish Enlightenment, which brought through ideas around academic thought, and a number of institutions were established up there. Edinburgh, Dundee, Glasgow, these were all established around the 1500s. Then in the 19th century, you have the university systems in London and Wales set up. And then in particular, you have the red brick institutions set up in the early 20th century. These institutions, you can find them and they're characterized by being in the new industrial cities of the north. So places such as Manchester, Leeds, and Sheffield as well. Then subsequent to that, we had a range of institutions of varying sizes and research concentrations, and these are variously called civic and plate glass. These sorts of institutions are like Exeter, Southampton, Newcastle, and they vary in size depending on whether they have a medical school generally. Then an important watershed happened in 1992. We had a set of institutions that were traditionally or partly publicly owned locally. Now these institutions were granted full autonomy and university status. They were traditionally polytechnics that were doing vocational education, and they were awarded full university status and their own degree awarding powers. They continue today, often with a vocational emphasis, but they also conduct a large amount of research now as well. They're typically known as the post-92s. Now, more recently, we've had a wave of smaller institutions. Typically, they were historically teaching colleges or colleges of religious education that had been awarded degree awarding powers and then subsequently were given university title. And then, right in this moment, we have a government initiative to try and open up the number of institutions coming into the sector. So they are trying to encourage a new type of provider to come in particular privately owned for-profit institutions. This is relatively recent. These institutions represent a very small part of the sector, but they drive a lot of the public debate about how the system should be administered. And this gives you, in total, about 180 institutions that can award degrees in the United Kingdom, 130 of which, give or take some technicalities, which will call themselves universities. So it's a large system, it's quite diverse, and the majority of which is set within a public administration system, but I'll come back onto that later on in the discussion. So, some numbers. In terms of the size of the sector, as you can see, there's been growth over the years. We teach about just under 2 million undergraduate students. These students are primarily from the United Kingdom, but they also come from Europe and overseas. And we also have about 500,000 postgraduate students, majority of which, well, no, there's a blend between full-time and part-time. So what this means is that we have about, just over 2 million students enrolled in UK higher education institutions. Now, as you can imagine, the UK population is about 60 million people. To have 2 million people enrolled at any given time means that we have quite a high social profile. As I'm sure you'll also appreciate from in Chile as well, all of these students tend to have parents, brothers and sisters, and so they all pay an interest in terms of what is happening in the higher education system. And so a lot of the changes that have been going on recently in the UK have had a very high political profile, also a very high political cost for certain parties as well. But that gives you a bit of an idea. But one of the main stories over the last decade has been growth. This sector has grown significantly, particularly from 1998, which is just in front of this graph, and I'll go on to that in a little bit more detail as we go along. So, in terms of what we study, the kind of subjects as you might imagine, you can see them all along here. So at the very top, in terms of numbers, we have biological sciences, creative art and design, engineering is a very big subject, particularly a postgraduate. Business and administrative studies is, well, I mean, we have over 300,000 students studying this now. There's been a very large growth from this. Often it's MBAs, and often this is international students coming to the United Kingdom as well. But you also have areas such as accountancy included in this. Other subjects where there's perhaps been a decline in recent years, well, historical and philosophical studies and languages in particular. Languages in the United Kingdom is a big problem, as evidenced by the fact that I'm doing this in English. The problem starts actually at undergraduate education. We've always had a very poor level of take-up in languages, and the government decided that language was no longer compulsory for the compulsory school-age qualification, which is a GCSE. Unsurprisingly, that means that fewer people now study languages at higher education level as well. It's considered a big problem, actually. Other areas that we've seen declines in education, that's more of a niche issue. Social studies is also a very big subject. Political science, my area. But what you can see here is that almost all of our universities will teach the full range of these types of courses. That's why the idea of a university is to teach across all of these things. Some institutions are more specialist. The London School of Economics, for example, they don't do chemistry or lab-based or science-type subjects. They're only doing social sciences. Equally, Imperial College, for example, they're only teaching engineering and science subjects. But in the main, most institutions will teach the full range. I've mentioned international students a couple of times. They are a significant story for the sector. If you visited a campus in about 1998, you would see quite a large number of international students. If you visited one now, you would notice the difference. We've over doubled the number of students coming to the United Kingdom. Primarily, these students are coming from China and India, and that's been driven by the economic growth and the growth of the middle class in those countries. We have long historic links there, but China as well. Chinese students, the UK is very popular to come and study. Obviously, this is because of the quality of the education that has been provided in the UK, but also studying English and studying in London is also very attractive as well. So that's also been quite a significant feature. But we have a number of initiatives whereby there's bilateral agreements with overseas countries. A big one has been the Science Without Borders program with your compatriots in Brazil. But also more recently, we've had an agreement here with Chile as well to fund scholarships and research relationships. And this was agreed following a group of vice-chancellors and my colleagues in the international unit who came here last year, and that agreement's been signed very recently, I think. So that's something that we find very positive in the United Kingdom. But in practice, this means that our universities are very globalized, the students are globalized, but also increasingly our staff as well, the academic staff within institutions coming from all over the world, in particular from Europe as well. I mentioned the diversity in the sector. This graph here will show you a little bit about the range in terms of the size and the income of institutions. So on the left-hand side is income, financial income. You'll see that two is definitely two. Two have more than £1 billion coming in. This is Oxford and Cambridge, unsurprisingly. Then the second tier between 500 million to 100 million. These are large research-intensive universities in the big cities. So I mentioned before places like Manchester, places like Leeds and Sheffield. These are those large institutions as well. But then the spread down here are either smaller research-intensive institutions or more teaching-focused institutions, such as the post-1992 institutions that I mentioned earlier on. And then, of course, we have some very sort of small specialist teaching institutions. I should add that all of these statistics here are for institutions that receive public funds. Now, they are by far the majority of institutions in the sector, but again, it's just worth noting that. In terms of the numbers of students, you'll see that there's one institution up there that has approximately 200,000 students. This is the Open University. So this university was established in the 1960s by government to deliver distance part-time education to mature learners. And it continues to this day. It's a highly successful institution, although you will notice that this graph actually illustrates the difference between 2012 and 2011. Now, as a part-time and mature focused institution, there's been a significant dip in the number of students studying part-time, and this has affected the Open University, and that's actually a big policy question that we're looking at in relation to fees. But as you can see, again, we have a big spread here. So, institutions between 30 and 50,000, University of Manchester, which is a big research-intensive university, but also Sheffield Hallam University, which is an old post-1992 institution that is primarily focused on teaching, for example. But then other institutions, so for example, 10 to 15,000, the London School of Economics, the University of Exeter, these are institutions that I studied at. They're considered in the smaller bracket. And then down in the bottom ranges, you have a lot of the newer institutions since 2000, typically old teacher education colleges that will have degree awarding powers, but maybe not university status. So that gives you a bit of an idea about the spread. As a membership organisation, we represent all of these institutions here. As you can imagine, bringing these ideas and the different interests together can also be a challenge for us as an organisation. Now, in terms of where we get our money from and what we spend it on, these two charts here will give you a bit more information about that. So what we have in the green box here, in the left-hand side, funding council grants. This is direct investment from the government. Now, this direct investment is now primarily in relation to research, but it also subsidizes some elements of undergraduate education, in particular in relation to high-cost subjects such as medicine, but also vulnerable subjects such as learning. What am I talking about? Languages. Then in this bottom box down here as well, we have fees, which represents about 22% of university income. So this will be UK and EU fees. So these will be the fees for undergraduate students, and this is supported by the loan book, which I'll talk about in more detail. Then you'll see in the orange box down here, this is non-EU students. Now this makes up 12% of the sector's total income, which is a significant amount. But in addition, it's an amount that can go up and down a lot more than other elements. So this is an interesting area of policy, particularly because the current government is keen to reduce immigration, and students are bracketed in that context. Then the other bit here is research grants and contracts. So this is both project-based grant funding, but also contract research that may be done for either private businesses or for government as well. Government is actually a significant purchaser of research by UK universities. Then other income, there's always various bits and pieces. This may well be income generated by the university itself, perhaps through conferencing facilities. More recently, there's been a realization that halls of residence that you have for students, which are empty throughout the summer, are actually very useful for running for conferences and advertising that. So that's an important area of income. But also, there's the other element, which is endowment and investment income. This isn't a good year for endowment and investment income, given the financial crises that have been happening for the 2 years earlier. In terms of expenditure, this has less detail. But as you can see, probably the same everywhere, staff costs are the significant overhead for the sector. This creates debate, shall we say, between the executive administrators of universities and also the wider academic staff. In particular, a lot of this cost is tied up in pensions. And pensions reform is incredibly contentious currently because, quite frankly, we're living too long and we're not saving enough money. How we solve that problem is in terms of the investment by staff and by institutions is actually a point of industrial dispute that has been occurring over the last couple of years. So yes, anyway, we better move on from that swiftly. Okay. Could you? Thank you. This just gives you a little illustration about where this income has been coming from and how it has changed. I'm going to point to the blue line. This line here, that's the tuition income. So as you can see, that's gone up. The green line, which is the funding body grants, has gone down. So this is the big story in terms of the relationship between universities and the public and their students as well. There we go. So in conversations that I've had so far about the UK system and the Chilean system, and the idea around what a public university is, I often start from the starting point that in the UK the comparison is quite difficult. The majority, in fact not all of our members, our institutions, are legally autonomous. So, in some respect they're independent private institutions, but they are constituted as charities. So they do have sort of public missions. They're not privately owned by individuals or a business. But this also gives you a bit of an idea about the types of relationships that our member institutions have with government in terms of the profile of public investment into their institution. So this graph shows you the percentage ratio of total public funding coming to an institution as a proportion of their income. So as you can see, you go from some institutions where it is upwards of 70% of their income, all the way down to others where it drops below 10%. Now, the majority of these institutions are subject to similar regulations and responsibilities in terms of towards government, but of course they have very different views about the degree to which they are dependent on public funding. So this is a discussion that we often have with government that often sees the sector as a single archetype, particularly when it comes to politicians. It's the university that they went to about 40 years ago. So we're often trying to explain to them that there is quite a wide range in terms of the relationship between institutions and public administration and public funds. This is also changing as well. What I should say is that some of these now, given this is 2012, the more research your institution does, the more you'll be to the left-hand side of this chart in terms of the public percentage of funding. The more that you're focused on teaching, the more likely it is that you're going to be down towards the right-hand side. And this is a big shift. Okay, so research funding. The UK is very proud of its research output. We like to consider ourselves one of the world leaders in terms of in academic research. And this is, of course, funded by public money. The government sees it as strategically important that research in the UK is well funded for economic and social reasons. And in the UK, in comparison to many of our European partners, this research takes place in universities. Now, this money is administered by what we call a dual support system. So one element of this is called the Quality-Related Research Fund. Now, this research is a core grant that is allocated to the university by the funding council, the National Funding Council. This allocation is made on the basis of an assessment of your institution's research outputs, which happens every 5 years. It gets called various different things, but currently it's called the Research Assessment Framework, the REF, or the RAF, they're always changing the name. So this essentially, an institution pulls the outputs that its academics have produced over the previous 5 years, they submit this to a panel, the panel makes an assessment, and then out the back of that, that assessment informs the amount of money that the institution receives. As you can imagine, this causes a lot of stress every 5 years for the people who are responsible for research. The other element to this is in relation to project-based research funding. We have 7 research funding councils that are structured around academic disciplines, such as the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council and the Economic and Social Science Research Council, to give 2 examples. Now, this is more typically focused around the academic. So the academic and their partners will submit project proposals, and then they will receive funding from that. But this, of course, is a significant source of income for the institution as well. So this is also a highly competitive area, and it distributes about 27% of research funding. The other element I'm going to point to as well is the purple bit, which is overseas research funding. We say overseas, it's only just over the sea. This is European research funding, and it's an increasingly significant amount of money that comes to the UK sector. This comes in 2 ways. This is both project funding, similar to the purple box there, but it also funds academics of excellence. and so the money follows the academic. Now, as with students who are attracted to coming to the UK because of the quality of the institutions and also working in a very sort of globalised country like the UK, it's also very attractive for European academics as well. So this is a significant source of research excellence within the UK. Again, another reason why, as a sector, we don't want to leave the European Union. So, now, I've mentioned research, I've talked about the amount of money that we get, but the other element here is about where this money goes. Now, the concentration of research in the UK is very concentrated in a small number of institutions in practice. Now, towards the left-hand side here, I don't know this for a fact, but I can pretty much promise you, this will be Oxford and Cambridge, Imperial, Manchester and UCL. The reason they score so highly is because they both conduct biomedical research, lab-based research, and engineering as well, particularly in Manchester. And then you have a second tier of institutions that are also considered research intensive. Some of these may be large, some of these may be smaller as well. But then we also have a large number of institutions who receive relatively small amounts, but at least a little bit of money, public money. And there is often an ongoing debate about whether concentration or diversity is good. One argument goes, you concentrate your funding within centres of excellence and you get the best return on investment. The other argument is made that, well, excellence can be found in many different places, and that actually having diverse centres of research excellence is also better for the dynamism and the development of new networks and new ideas in research funding. This is a debate, given that our members spread across this whole spectrum, is one that Universities UK has to be very careful in. So, of course, we try and argue for just increasing the amount of money. We let others argue about where that money should go to. So, yeah, it's very contentious. This just gives you another illustration, actually, in terms of, this again is talking about research income, but this gives you an idea about the percentage of total income as well. So whilst the amount of income for a number of institutions, it may be small in terms of absolute values, actually in percentage terms it is still quite significant. So if you can imagine that actually playing into practice within the institution, it does perform an important role in giving academics who are primarily focused on teaching at least some space to conduct research. And this allows these institutions to enable a research-informed environment for their teaching, which is a feature across the majority of the sector, obviously to greater degrees. And of course, in many institutions that are heavily research-intensive, a lot of those research academics really don't do very much teaching at all. And again, this is an area of current discussion with the government. This is another chart on the amount of money that is spent by the United Kingdom. Often when talking to delegations coming to the UK, sort of use this just to illustrate where the UK is in comparison to the amount of money that we spend. In Universities UK, we argue that this should be much higher, quite frankly. We're the green line here. As a percentage of our GDP, the amount of money that we invest. Now, as you can see, that's been going down a little bit in comparison to our European partners. This is much lower, but just in an international context, it's worth noting this column here. This, of course, is China. So, in terms of a percentage of GDP, they are now up to, well, just under 2%. But of course, Chinese GDP is significantly larger than the United Kingdom now. And I think this is something that a lot of our institutions, particularly those who are engaged in global research networks, are increasingly aware of, making those kind of connections with Chinese institutions overseas. Of course, this also brings sort of significant challenges in relation to the politics of China and the relationship that those institutions have with their government, because it does contrast quite significantly with the way that UK universities universities are run as well. But that is a long-term strategic trend and something that a lot of our institutions are actively trying to engage with. And you'll see institutions such as the University of Nottingham, for example, they have quite a significant campus in Ningbo in China, where they're teaching students on the ground. Now, some people ask me, is this about generating revenue? And the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Nottingham would certainly say, definitely not. They do not generate any money out of that. In fact, it costs a lot of money to run. But what it does mean is they have a presence in the country that allows them to generate these kind of academic links as well. Now, I mentioned it just before, in terms of UK universities and research and development, you can see us picked out in the green dot here. So, in general, the UK, our universities in the UK, we perform a lot of the publicly funded research. In fact, we perform most of the research in the country more generally. This is partly a product of the deindustrialization of the UK, shall we say. So we have fewer manufacturing industries conducting their own research and development, because primarily we deliver services, financial services, which don't tend to show up in this. They're very imaginative with their products, but I don't know whether you call it research and development. You might call it something else and it would be a rude word, but there we go. But we also have, but in comparison to Germany and France, for example, they have very different systems in terms of where they spend their funding. So, for example, in Germany, they typically have specialized research institutes that aren't connected to their universities. So you're not always comparing like with like, but of course that also means that any government science policy and research and development policy is directly impacted on, it has a direct impact on UK universities. And just to illustrate this point, which is something I'm going to mention in more detail later on, but our home government department is the Department for Business, Innovation and Skills. It's an economic department rather than an education department. There's an entirely separate education department which runs schools and other elements of further education. But this just gives you a bit of an idea about where universities sit in the wider public policy debate within the United Kingdom. From our point of view, yes, our universities deliver education, but from a very practical point of view, we quite like having our own department, because to try and compete with schools in the education department can often leave you, a little bit under-influenced. So that's the situation we have there. So I've given you a bit of an overview in terms of the sector. I've given you an overview about the numbers of students that we have, the number of students that we teach in the United Kingdom. The numbers have grown over the last 15 to 20 years. I've also given you an idea about the increased volume of international students coming into the sector. We have an increasingly mobile student population. We also have an increasingly mobile academic population as well, both coming into the country and leaving the country to participate in European funding schemes. And we also play a very important role in terms of the economic development of the United Kingdom. But as I've mentioned, higher education has been a very controversial area of public policy recently. In particular, this is in the context of constrained public funds following the 2008 financial crisis, which had a very significant impact on the United Kingdom. This was the biggest recession that we've had since the Great Depression, which preceded the Second World War. So as you can imagine, this had a very substantial impact on public finances. In addition, however, we've also seen, in that context, in fact, we've seen some substantial reforms to funding, in particular in relation to students. And the politics of that have meant that higher education has been to the forefront of electoral politics, which is something that hasn't always been the case. And in that context, we're also seeing an evolution in the way that universities and students relate to each other and the role that students play in public policy that you might find of interest or use in terms of the Chilean context. So just to reiterate what we're going through in the United Kingdom, this green line here is public sector spending, basically. Well, this here is the financial crisis. That here is bailing out the banks. And then this here is the impact on public services and spending on public services. So there has been, per year, so this is, each year, a 2% cut in public spending over the last 5 years. And now with the Conservative government that has a full majority on their own, this is going to continue at a rate of 2.2%. Now, there are many economists who would question whether this is actually going to happen or not, but the reality is that the amount of money available for public services is significantly reduced, and we're starting to see the impacts of that, particularly in local social care, for example, and also in the NHS as well. The healthcare service. So in that context, Universities UK have been working very hard, I think we would probably right to say, to maintain the level of investment in overall research. And what we were able to achieve last time around is essentially a maintenance of in cash terms of the amount of research funding that was spent, that was directed to the sector. Now, obviously, this does go down a little bit in real terms because there has been some inflation, although not very much. But this was a success on our part, but also recognition by the government that actually maintaining investment in research and development of good, high academic standards was a long-term strategic interest of the UK economy. And the universities have been positioned at the very heart of that sort of debate, which has been very beneficial in terms of maintaining this type of income into the sector. But it does give us great responsibilities, and it has come with some strings attached, I think it's probably fair to say. The other trend in that, in relation to the research concentration argument, is that with less money, it has become more concentrated into a smaller number of institutions. So this means that there are a larger number of teaching-focused institutions who now receive very, very little public research funding, which is changing the nature of their relationship with government and public policy. So as you can see, the right-hand side of that, those institutions who receive the most actually got an increase in the amount of money that they were receiving. But this kind of concentration and division is also a product of how this research assessment exercise is run. So public funding, as I mentioned before, in terms of research, is allocated on the basis of excellence. What we have in the research excellence framework is a series of assessment panels where institutions submit the research outputs done by their academics. But this time, this last year, for the first time, 20% of your assessment was based on the real-world impact of your research. So it wasn't enough just to be classed by your fellow peer academics as being excellent by academic standards. You also had to demonstrate that it had some kind of real-world application. You didn't have to, but you would get a beneficial score if you did. So that's been changing the framework and the prioritization of the work that many academics and departments have been doing in terms of their research. What it also means as well, though, is that it enables you to make funding decisions that may be seen as contentious if they're viewed through a prism of sectional interest, whereby certain institutions get more money than others. By positioning it in an excellence framework, it takes some of those politics out of that out of that debate. So the justification for getting money is based on the quality of your outputs, rather than based on the interests of your institution or the sectional debates between different types of institutions as well. Now, obviously, if you're an institution that's lost out on that, you may consider this to be unfair, and if you're an institution that's done well, you think is a perfectly reasonable system. But this system was actually introduced in the 1980s to enable these kind of decisions to be made through a sort of a technical assessment process, as opposed to a politicized institutional stakeholder process. And it tended to work relatively well. And it also means that we've been able to drive up the quality of academic output. So this gives you a bit of an idea about the sort of work that the UK does. So these two charts here are sort of weighted scores comparing the UK outputs with other key national systems. So we've got the United Kingdom in red, Germany, which is DEU, in blue, the United States, and China. Now, obviously, these are weighted by both general economic, national economic output, and also, and then on the right-hand side, by researchers. And what we tend to show in the UK is that the UK produces high numbers of highly cited articles. particularly when you take it by the number of researchers. So this implies that we have a very productive sector that is pumping out a lot of research outputs in terms of journal articles. This is partly a product of the Research Excellence Framework because it incentivizes the production of more outputs. So it's a performance framework for institutions that means we're producing a lot more. However, the important point to note, though, is in relation to the amount of the research outputs that are converted into patents. So where you can actually commercialize the outputs of this research. And the UK, in comparison to Japan and Germany in particular, performs very badly on this. Now, there are two reasons behind this. One is that a lot of this research may well not actually produce stuff that you can put into patents. So if you're doing social science research and you're still getting cited quite a lot, you may not get a patent out of that unless, whereas if you're doing engineering like you may well be doing in Japan and Germany, it's more likely to be patentable research. But what that's also illustrated to governments as well is that, and also to our institutions, is that it is important for universities to understand how they can engage their research with real-world organizations and try and translate that into real-world impact, including economic impact. And this is the trade-off for us maintaining the level of funding in these straitened times, that we have to demonstrate the economic impact of our work. And in particular, the economic impact of our work is not just at a national level, but it's at a local level as well. And one of the most powerful things that we're able to demonstrate in Universities UK when we're talking with policymakers is the impact that universities have at a local level in two ways. The first way is, of course, in students. The second element is, of course, in the number of people that those institutions employ. And the third one is around supporting local businesses and industries to develop what they do and how they work. But the big challenge for our sector is, well, easy is the wrong word, it is possible to, as a big organisation, to work with other big organisations who might have their own R&D departments, who might have their own outreach departments. It is much harder to engage with the small and the medium-sized enterprises that you might find in regional towns and cities across the United Kingdom. So there's a very big push now to help and facilitate that kind of engagement and collaboration between universities, their academics, and businesses in the local area. And this is an incredibly important element for us in terms of making the case to politicians and policymakers about maintaining the public investment in UK universities. I mean, it's great. If ever you talk to MPs and ministers about what they think about higher education, and, they'll often say, oh, well, it costs too much and there's too many students going. But of course, not when it comes to the institution that's in their constituency. And so it's very useful in terms of identifying where we have that local economic impact in terms of the political and public debates of the day. And it's a core component of our political strategy, actually. But increasingly, the mechanisms and the systems through which universities can help their academics engage with local businesses, your business administration people, and other sort of product development type work as well. Now, that was research. The story is that we managed to keep our money, but we had to demonstrate more real-world impact for it. Where it was really contentious is in relation to student funding. We used to have a system of direct public grants into the United Kingdom. Now we've shifted to a fees and loan system. And this chart on the left-hand side here, illustrates what happened from 1989 until 2010-11. The red line is the planned public unit cost, i.e. the amount of money that the government was spending on each individual student. What we had in 1989-90, and then once we had the post-92, the old polytechnics joining the sector, what we saw was an increase in numbers, but no increase in funding with that. And in fact, the amount of money available for each student went down to a level whereby the sector was severely underfunded by the late 1990s. So the Labour government came in under Tony Blair in 1998, and they decided that rather than directing public money into this system, what they're going to ask for is for students, or more specifically in 1998, their parents to make a contribution. This was called a top-up fee. It was £1,000. I was the very first year to pay it, which is a little bit frustrating, but never mind. So from that point onwards, we introduced the idea of having a fee in the system whereby we hadn't had one previously. But as you can see, this fee was topping up what public funding was already going into the system. Then, in 2003, it was realised that actually an upfront fee of £1,000 based on your parents' ability to pay was problematic in terms of social access questions. So what was then introduced was another increase in the fee, this time to £3,000, which again was additional money coming into the sector, but it was decided that the fee would no longer be paid at the point of entry, it would be paid by the government, and then a public loan system would be established whereby the student would repay that loan over a defined period of time and based on their ability to pay. Now, of course, this system wasn't popular at the time, but it still went ahead. It really wasn't popular, particularly as the Labour government at the time had said just prior to the election that they had no plans to increase fees, and then they did increase fees. It's very useful to have a big majority, you can push these kind of things through. But that system bedded in until 2012. Now, in the context of the financial crisis and the reduction in the public, in the amount of money available for public money available, the new government decided that they would do away entirely, well, not entirely, but pretty much in total, the direct public funding into the system, and introduced and trebled the fees up to a maximum of £9,000. In theory, this was a maximum. In practice, and that there would be a wide range of prices being offered by institutions. In practice, the average is about £8,600. So as you can see, people saw the money and they went for it. Now, admittedly, though, that figure is based on the economic costing that was already being provided to universities. So this time it wasn't new money. So this is what it illustrates here.
Esto lo ilustra acá este gráfico. Acá vemos un gráfico que nos muestra el cambio en la balanza de ingresos de las donaciones para enseñanza y los aranceles. Y le escucho un poquito mal porque está muy lejos del micrófono, perdone. Esto fue en un plazo de un estudio que hemos realizado durante 30 años. Y el promedio que tenemos es de 24.000 libras al año. Y acá
over a period of time. So the government maintains its subsidy in terms of students going to study undergraduate education. But this subsidy goes up and down depending on the economic outcomes of the student themselves. So what we have is a graph that looks like this. The red line is the amount that the government ends up subsidizing, and the blue chart is the amount that the student ends up paying. So in the left-hand side, you basically have a student who earns very little at all after graduating. The government ends up subsidizing almost the entirety of their education. On the right-hand side, you have students who go on and earn lots of money after graduating. And what they do is they repay all of their fees, but they also, because of interest, because of the way the interest rate is structured, they actually cross-subsidize a little bit other students. Now, if you take this chart here, it essentially means that the risk of studying at university, the fee, you don't carry any of the risk. The amount that you pay is based on the amount that you earn after university. And for the vast majority of students, the government will continue to subsidize a proportion, at least, of your education. What we calculate at this stage is that students will end up, on average, repay about 60% of their fee, and the government will continue to pay about 40% of their fee. But that goes up and down depending on how well the economy does. So if the economy does well, the amount that the government pays goes down. If the economy doesn't do well, the amount the government pays goes up. Now, I said the fee of £9,000 that's the maximum fee that any institution that receives public funds can set. That is regulated by law. It is regulated by virtue of receiving public money. But of course, in relation to international students, their fee is not regulated at all. So this actually means there's quite a big sort of discretionary income that institutions can generate here. And as you can see, I mentioned a 12% overall for the sector, but many institutions are nearly 20% of their income comes from international students. We currently have a government that's trying to restrict the number of people coming into the UK. Students are caught up in that debate. It's a great area of contention between us and the government. But as you can see, it's very significant for many institutions. Now, just the final thing I want to touch on is in relation to how public policy is administered in the United Kingdom. I've illustrated a situation where we have quite a diverse sector in terms of the students who study. We have quite a diverse sector in terms of the size and the mission of institutions. We have a diverse sector in terms of the amount of money that institutions receive from public funds. And we also have a system whereby institutions are not controlled in terms of the amount of students they can recruit, but that all of their teaching income comes from their students and the amount of students they can attract. So we have quite a complicated system now in terms of the profile and the diversity of institutions. And the apparatus that we have established in the United Kingdom wasn't set up for that kind of system. But I'll just talk you through very quickly how it works. We have a funding council that distributes public money and requires accountability from institutions in terms of their financial and governance and the probity of their financial governance. We have a quality standards body called the Quality Assessment Agency. This is an organisation that was established by my organisation in collaboration with others. It is a sector-owned body. It runs assessments on a 5-year cycle of institutions to ensure that you are delivering to a certain standard of academic quality. It is a condition of receiving public funding that you are subject to this assessment arrangement. And if you fail that assessment, in theory, you could have your public funding withdrawn. In practice, you work through it. We also have a number of organisations that the sector works together with. So these are developmental organisations. So there's the Higher Education Academy, which is the professional body for academics and teaching. And we also have the Leadership Foundation, which is often around sort of the management of institutions as well. And what we say is this represents a collaborative approach to policy making within the sector. I should also mention that we also have a devolved policy framework now, and in Scotland, much of what I've been talking about doesn't apply. So in Scotland, you don't pay fees. The government continues to subsidise Scottish students only. They won't subsidise English students. It's a big bone of contention for English students, but there we go. So there is a bit of diversity there. But in England, which is by far the vast bulk of the country, what I've just described still applies. But what we've got changing now is increasingly this funding body here doesn't provide public funds to many institutions, so the basis on which it regulates them doesn't really exist in quite the same way. The QAA still exists, but they're trying to deal with a much wider range of institutions, including new arrivals into the sector who aren't set up on the same kind of models. And so increasingly they're having to sort of set assessment frameworks that are in theory comparable, but in practice are quite onerous and very prescriptive. So what we've had recently in the changes in the system and in the change in the sector, in particular in relation to the student funding system, is the arrival of 2 new regulators into our work. We have the Information Commissioner's Office, which is essentially the FOI, the Freedom of Information Act, and universities are considered public bodies, and therefore we have to respond to information requests from the public. And the second one is the Competition and Markets Authority. Now, in theory, we operate in a market where we compete for students and we charge them a fee to study at university. So that then means we're subject to a range of consumer rights regulations, whereby institutions have to provide students with clear and accurate information. They have to provide them with a contract of study that is fair and proportionate and not unbalanced. And the CMA has the power to essentially take people to court if they are believed to not be respecting these rights of students as consumers. This is a very new entrant into the sector. We're just working through the implications of this, because obviously, the student-institution relationship is not simply a transactional one, but it's an important element for ensuring that the rights of students in an increasingly diverse system and an increasingly complex system are in theory protected. But how that works out in practice is another question. Now, within all of this, at the very beginning, I said that institutions are independent, they're fully autonomous. We receive a lot of public money, but we're regulated at an arm's length from government. But what I think all of our members are very clear on is that the success of UK institutions is in relation to the effectiveness of their public missions and their public value. And the way that we look at it, there are essentially four components that universities need to balance themselves off against. There's the public interest, the public's interest in economic growth and social equity in terms of access and outcomes from higher education. There's operating in increasingly complicated and competitive markets and making sure that your university is able to respond to this context in an effective way. Equally, it's important for universities as civic institutions that are publicly engaged to understand and also lead the kind of social, economic and technological changes that are happening in society and not to be walled off as ivory towers. And then finally, for the university, it's about maintaining both the autonomy and the freedom of the institution to be able to respond to these kind of dynamics and trends in an effective way, whilst also maintaining your reputation for academic quality and also your financial sustainability. Now, within all of these, within this sort of framework, you have lots of new issues, things like new research agendas, things like international collaborations, things like dealing with new providers and new ways of delivering education. And for all of our members, it's about how their institution can be proactive in responding to these different interests and priorities and dealing with the new issues of the day as they come forward, but recognizing that in many cases, our universities have been around for decades, if not hundreds of years, and the idea is hopefully to be around for decades, if not hundreds of years into the future as well. So there we go. That is a whistle-stop tour of UK higher education, but I often leave it on this final point here. We're going through difficult times in terms of where our money comes from. We're going through significant change in terms of the way that students fund their education and the sort of relationship that we have with students. And there are lots of governance changes that are going on in terms of UK higher education policy. But we do run a survey every year of UK students. It's called the National Student Survey. And question 22 is about your overall satisfaction with your course. And this chart here will show you that it seems to be going up, and it still seems to be going up, even though we're charging them £9,000 a year. So this is the good news story from UK higher education in terms of our relationship with students. You could probably push all sorts of methodological holes through this survey, but there we go. I'll leave it on that.